We're going to start off this morning's presentations with a presentation by the United Nations Capital Development Fund. We are pleased to have joined us this morning Ms. Helen Gradstein and Mark Wensley, who are going to jointly present a presentation on measuring digital economies and creating an enabling environment for financial innovation. I'd like to kindly ask that you give them your due attention and of course, save your questions and answers for the end of their presentation. I'll hand over to our AV team, Helen and Mark.
Thank you so much. Is everybody able to hear me this morning? I'm assuming hopefully everyone's able to hear me. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present. Well, thank you to all. We're very happy to be here today, and I'm hoping my colleague Mark is also available on the line to present the PowerPoint as well. So today we will be able to focus on a presentation to hopefully set the stage, in essence, how to develop and create an enabling digital finance ecosystem. And what we have here today is to present two separate presentations. The first around the Inclusive Digital Economy Scorecard, which is a measurement tool designed by the United Nations Capital Development Fund, and then the second around an enabling regulatory environment to enable digital financial innovation. On the next slide, I would like to just provide a brief introduction of the United Nations Capital Development Fund. So the United Nations Capital Development Fund is a United Nations agency. Sorry, Mark, next slide, please. Yes, so the United Nations Capital Development Fund. So we are, for those who don't know us, we recently opened up our Eastern Caribbean offices last February of 2022, and we're very happy to be here. My name is Helen Gradstein, and I am the regional lead and head of the UNCDF Eastern Caribbean office, which is based here in Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago. Apologies that we weren't able to join everybody today in Barbados. And the UNCDF, what does our program in the Caribbean do? We try to make ourselves agile, available, and technical. And currently our flagship program, which is funded by the European Union and provides support to enable digital finance policy initiatives, as well as provide investment in the private sector, works across Trinidad and Tobago, as well as the Eastern Caribbean states. And in general, our UNCDF office provides a mixture of different programs, particularly regional policy acceleration programs, which provides mixes of technical assistance and boot camps, workshops, and training, as well as financing to scale innovation and new fintechs with promise for financial inclusion, as well as a window for discrete technical assistance. And I'm just going to hand it over to my colleague Mark for himself to introduce himself and to kick us off with the United Nations Capital Development Fund Inclusive Digital Economy Scorecard, again, which helps to set the stage for today's conference and hopefully provide some meaningful dialogue on what are the pieces for a digital economy and how it could be measured. Thank you very much. Mark, over to you.
Good morning. My name is Mark Wensley. I am a digital advisor with the United Nations Capital Development Fund, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today to share how the Inclusive Digital Economy Scorecard measures the development and inclusiveness of the digital economy, as well as to share a few examples of how data-driven tools like IDIS are being adopted into decision-making processes to operationalize and advance key policy changes. You will hear me refer to the term IDIS. So I first want to take some time to define it. IDIS stands for the Inclusive Digital Economy Scorecard. IDIS has been designed with and for policymakers to help them understand the status of their digital journeys and to set the right priorities for the years ahead. IDIS is a metrics-driven tool which presents comprehensive high-level data, and IDIS is now in its third edition. Data was collected in 26 countries last year, and we are now preparing for the launch of the fourth update this year. I should also mention that IDIS is implemented in the countries where we have on-the-ground experts and experience. So together with our government partners, UNCDF collects and validates the data. I will share a few examples later on of how partners are adopting this tool. But first, I just want to highlight UNCDF's unique role in helping to score market barriers and to engage policymakers on the strategic findings from the scorecard. For more than a decade, UNCDF has supported central banks to leverage the power of digitalization to transform the financial systems and to make them more inclusive with basic technologies. In the last 5 years, our support has expanded to ministries and bodies with strategic responsibility for digital economy transformation, such as ministries of ICT and digital economy, science and technology, and national planning authorities, to mention a few. As an active facilitator of market systems development, UNCDF is able to build on our relationships with the private sector to engage them and to really identify barriers that are limiting the growth and inclusion of their services, which equips us to help provide expert judgment in several key areas. And we will be hearing more from Helen later on in the session about how UNCDF is working with governments today in many different areas to do this. Coming back to IDIS, you've heard me mention the financial sector, but as we know, there are many other sectors that are undergoing digitalization. Digital transformation shapes a wide range of sectors, extending to agriculture, education, health, transportation, etc. And this involves numerous government agencies and a broad set of actors in the private sector and civil society. So to chart a path to successful digital transformation, it's crucial to coordinate the efforts of many stakeholders. And fundamentally, this effort must strengthen a core set of digital building blocks, namely policy and regulation, infrastructure, innovation, and skills. These are part of many digital economy frameworks. What IDIS does is to build on this holistic framework with a metrics-based approach to start measuring and tracking the development of the digital economy, really recognizing that all of these digital building blocks must be strengthened, and that one without the other prevents access to and use of digital technologies to digitize sectors and economic activity. So, for example, on policy and regulation, this holistic framework expands the aperture for assessment from active policy promotion for interoperable infrastructure to how policy is introducing and pushing digitalized social transfers and G2P alongside test and learn regulatory approaches to promote innovation. On infrastructure, for example, it opens up the aperture for assessment from digital connectivity and device ownership to open digital payment systems and digital identity systems. With this approach, we're connecting policy and regulation to how services enter into the transactions and the participation of people and small businesses in the economy. For some policymakers, this holistic framework serves as a quick inventory of enabling and inclusive policies to compare against and to prompt strategic reflection and discussions. As this happens, we recognize that making digital transformation inclusive really requires an intentional focus on the various segments of the population that are too often left behind from innovation and access to skills and services. These are rural populations, women, youth, MSMEs, refugees, migrants, elderly, and the disabled. And building from a place of what gets measured gets managed we are bringing data to both the segments and these core pillars about the barriers they face, really to help governments and the private sector to better understand their markets, to help frame the problems to address, and to focus on the right priorities. More data is being collected, but there are still gaps really to form a full picture of inclusive digital transformation. And this is why UNCDF has partnered with the EU, UNCTAD, GSMA, UNDESA, UNDP, ADB, and governments in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific to build IDIS and to include relevant proxies and data that can be used to really assess whether and how the digital economy is developing. So I'm just going to go to the next slide here. Sorry, bear with me. So just to talk a little bit more about the tool, there is a problem where a lack of comprehensive, timely, and action-oriented data creates a barrier to really taking a data-driven decision-making approach. And this happens at exactly the time when a lot of governments are under urgent pressure to accelerate national digital economy transformation. And they're early in their journey and they really have to take a running start. So IDIS enters into the picture as an accessible tool, as something that can be used with really low barriers to understand what's happening and which key elements to focus on. Some of the defining features of the tool is that it's metrics driven with flexibility. So it can draw from global data sets by default, and it can also substitute in local data sets that are more trusted or integrated into M&E that's used by policymakers, for example. It's also a tool that can leverage our in-country expertise. So really building on our relationship with the private sector to help inform findings. We can help with scoring and expert assessment on particular areas. But beyond that, UNCDF provides active support to facilitate working groups with the government to validate the data, to internalize findings, and really to support reflection on priority setting at key inflection points. The tool presents data in a comprehensive way. And I think an important thing is that it's an evolving tool. So we have a collaborative approach with this tool so that as needs of policymakers evolve, we can also update the methodology. And for example, in 2022, we launched the Women's Inclusivity Score to bring greater visibility and framing to the barriers that women face in participating in the digital economy. This is all with the several use cases in mind. So we are really looking at how to support policymakers to identify key market barriers, to help set the right priorities, and also to measure and track the development and inclusiveness of the digital economy. Again, I'm just going to go to the next slide here. I want to give you an example now where IDIS is being used. And to do that, I'll zoom into Uganda, which is an early adopter country where policymakers are using IDIS. And this is just a quick snapshot to show, some of the analytics that come out of the scorecard. And if we look here, we can see that the digital economy score in Uganda has made progress year on year, but they still have plenty to do. And what's offered through the framework is also to see that from an inclusiveness perspective, several groups, especially rural communities and women, still experience gaps and face challenges to participate and benefit from the digital economy, and more so for women. And one of the things that came out of the implementation of IDIS in Uganda, and this was shared through a recent community of practice where we brought together 40 policymakers from 15 different countries where we are implementing IDIS to really talk about, how have they started to reflect on these findings and what can they be doing to advance the agenda. They shared, some really interesting insights, which I thought could be informative here. And, there's two ways to look at it. Within each of these holistic building blocks, there are deficits, but then there's also the comparison of the building blocks to see where those deficits are greatest. And in this particular example, we can see that when looking at policy and regulation in the country, they scored very highly, and at the same time, outcomes were falling short in several key areas, such as infrastructure and innovation had decreased despite active government focus on this area. And so one of the key takeaways was that, the many laws and policies, guidelines, and strategies that had emerged over the years as they were dynamically responding weren't being effectively implemented. And so it was really through the comparison on the scores that they were able to identify this as an area for action and review. So we've worked with our partner in Uganda now to really take a comprehensive review of the policies and look for opportunities to streamline them. We're helping with this review and inventory to look for areas where things can be improved from an implementation perspective as well. And so this is one example of how actions have been taken on based on IDIS, but there's other examples, and I'll just name a few where the adoption of a data-driven tool has enabled the operationalization of strategies. So our partner in Uganda, the Ministry of ICT and Digital Transformation, was focused on identifying actions to mainstream digitalization in the National Development Plan when IDIS was first implemented. And based off of the data that was generated, the engagement with the ministry, we were able to work with them to engage the working group that coordinates digital transformation across ministries to both to engage on the findings, but also to adopt it as a baseline for the working group to really ensure that ongoing strategic conversations really reflected both on the priorities and outcomes. A second example is that the Ministry of ICT has also started to use IDIS in linking budget planning across the various regulators, infrastructure authorities, departments, and other departments and ministries which they have responsibility, so that they can create a more focused approach in how budgets are aligning to the priorities that are being articulated in IDIS. So zooming out, we do see quite a few other examples among our partners where IDIS is being used really across the life cycle of policymaking. And there we go. So in particular, using IDIS to inform national digital economy strategies. So being able to quickly reference statistics on what's happening in the market, where the barriers are, to really help set priorities, for example, at the strategy development stage. But also more specifically to identify if, for example, there are deficits around how the cybersecurity is working or how interoperable infrastructure is being promoted, to really identify constraints hindering development where policy actions can be taken. And we are also supporting partners to do some of these things. And then lastly, to help with the evaluation of strategies to really reflect on whether or not their strategies are having the effect on outcomes that they seek to achieve. So adopting them for monitoring and evaluation. And I think with that, I'll just end on the note that, IDIS really started as a tool and it's expanded to a community of users. We now have a community of practice that is actively discussing how they are measuring the economy, what they can do to really implement more effective policies, and how to lead transformation across government. And central to the approach is this data-driven decision-making process to really get broader agreement and visibility into the challenges facing marginalized groups in the economy. So with that, I do want to hand over to Helen, and I will flip through slides as you need, Helen. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you for providing and setting the stage. And one of the big opportunities of the IDIS scorecard is that it essentially provides the initial points of a blueprint for what are the activities. First of all, where do countries, how can they benchmark themselves, either against peers or global good standards, to create that digital, like a thriving digital economy, but also, how can you use it also as a blueprint for moving forward, and how do you address those gaps? And so during this presentation, we want to essentially zoom into one pillar of the digital economy scorecard, particularly around digital finance, and talk around the legal regulatory frameworks that we find are good practices and huge enablers for a digital finance ecosystem, as well as some policy initiatives as well that complement and create a more thriving ecosystem in general. Would you mind moving to the next slide? Perfect. So digital finance, financial inclusion, and the UNCDF. So many people, while we've landed and just started our operations here in Trinidad and Tobago, as the regional office, we have received the question, why focus on fintech and digital finance? And for us, the answer is quite easy. The UNCDF, we believe that financial inclusion, which is essentially the uptake and usage of a range of appropriate financial products and services, both digital and traditional, by individuals and MSMEs, and that's provided in a manner that's sustainable and accessible and safe to the consumer, is a contributing factor towards the Sustainable Development Goals. In general, financial inclusion helps low-income and more marginalized consumers have more economic resilience to mitigate shocks, and then also grow their own economic livelihoods and be able to invest in more income-generating activities, among other strategies to build wealth and to manage wealth longer term. And fintech helps us to achieve many of these key elements, fintech and digital finance, and just different digital financial innovations in general. It helps to make finance more accessible, more usable, particularly because they're able to now come onto someone's mobile phone. There's different applications available. You can potentially make payments around the world using QR codes with linked accounts, etc. It's more accessible because you're able to use a wider range of agent networks as opposed to always walking to your bank branch. It makes products and services more diverse, appropriate, competitive, and also it can help to create more sustainable products as well. And one other question we receive often, and particularly important for small island states, is why digital finance from an inclusion perspective, especially if it's easy to drive 20 minutes and you're, at quite a big point of urbanization, or if you can go from one side to the island fairly quickly as compared to other countries, what's the real need for digital finance? And again, this is where we look at inclusion, because we see lots of marginalized or more vulnerable adults in more rural areas around the region having to essentially expend a lot of time, effort, and money to use transport. And to have to transport themselves. So in essence, these are the reasons why it's important. And I just received a note that we only have about 5 minutes, so I'm going to move a little bit more quickly. So on the next slide, you can see that in essence, the way to build a digitally financial inclusive ecosystem, that there's many different frameworks already available in the market. These two were created by the Payments Aspects of Financial Inclusion from the Committee of Payments and Market Infrastructures and World Bank, around how to drive digital payments for financial inclusion. In essence, since 2016, when the framework first came out by the World Bank and CPMI, it transitioned to what you see on the right as a poppy wheel, which incorporates all of the elements relevant for digital finance. But in essence, how do you really do this? And on the next slide, you can see a slightly adapted framework. And I think in a rapid way, I'm going to explain two basic frameworks around how to create the right policy initiatives, as well as the legal regulatory framework to enable digital finance and fintech, as well as how to create a thriving ecosystem. And while there's no silver bullet framework and there's no right answer, it's generally the confluence of the two where we've seen a lot of success. So I'm just going to briefly mention some of the key points in this house. And Mark, on the next slide, you can see the first. Apologies. And here's the second framework for essentially establishing a thriving fintech ecosystem. And this was adapted by the approach of Singapore, where in essence, you need to create policy initiatives as well as have the legal framework to enable fintechs or other innovations and entrepreneurs to access capital, to be able to operate in the market with the enabling policy environment, to have access to customers, partners, and policymakers. And we're seeing some very encouraging efforts on this front from across the region, as well as opportunity or policy initiatives to nurture business skills and talent. So on the next slide, we're just going to start piece by piece. In essence, one of the biggest foundations is public and private sector commitment. And what does this mean? Generally, there's a driving or a steering force behind creating this agenda that helps to put all these pieces together. And generally, this is an agency either housed within a central bank or within a Ministry of Finance, or multiple agencies as part of a committee that establish either financial inclusion strategies or digital finance roadmaps or digital economy strategies that all have the digital finance portions in place to help create and steer a way forward. It also includes putting in place those adequate data infrastructures, particularly the demand side data to understand the gaps from consumers and merchants, supply side data generally taken from ministries and in particular the central bank around account ownership, and then geospatial data to understand any types of gaps in accessibility. Then there's generally communication, engagement in international, regional, and domestic forums, for instance, the BTCA or AFI, many of which those in the room today are already aligned with. And then collaboration and coordination. And this is one piece I want to point out, because I think it's a piece that's not always well understood, and also a piece that's incredibly important, which is how do the regulators collaborate with domestic institutions to drive this agenda forward. For instance, what should be some of the role of the regulators? In some countries, regulators take a huge suite of activities under this space. And what should maybe be the role of other institutions and government agencies who might be able to come in and provide, because of different resource capabilities or however the jurisdiction looks. In terms of its political environment, it might be able to provide another housing for policy initiatives that otherwise couldn't be held under a regulator. So it's important to keep those in mind, as well as collaboration between the telecommunications sector and the financial sector, since many of these digital innovations go through mobile rails. On the next slide, you're going to see a critical piece, and I'm just going to take a little bit of time to explain this one, and then we'll go through the rest a little bit quickly. But since the theme of this entire workshop is around the legal regulatory frameworks, it's important to understand what are really those fundamental blueprint activities which create and enable a digital finance ecosystem. The first being a special licensing window for non-banks to become e-money issuers or to issue some type of e-money account. And in general, these are often provided either through e-money orders or issuance, e-money issuances, or e-wallet orders. There's different terms that we see around the world, but these specialized licensing windows allow non-banks to provide e-money accounts or prepaid or store value accounts without being subject to the full range of prudential rules applicable to commercial banks. And it often includes details around e-float and other prudential safeguards, particularly when this is newer to the market. For instance, e-money issuers who might pose a systemic risk. How can you then mitigate those risks with the particular safeguards in place? For instance, the e-wallet limits, the actual limit of the wallet itself, or being able to ring fence customer funds, etc. And one thing that's very important around non-bank e-money issuance, because I know that many countries have already begun to place e-money orders or e-wallet orders across the region, is flexibility. The e-money order itself does not guarantee effectiveness. Often there's an iterative process that we see around the world in order for regulators to really understand what are the right, as well as policymakers, what are the right types of limits and mitigation activities, along with the right types of requirements to put onto non-banks in order to make this an effective and competitive environment. So the flexibility to make a more effective non-bank e-money framework is incredibly important. And when I mean by flexibility, when I talk about flexibility, what I mean is that, for instance, if you have a set of requirements and a few e-money providers or potential applicants are not able to meet those requirements, that there's a flexible window where you can provide a no objection or an exemption, or sometimes the case of a sandbox for slight variations of that order, or semi-slight, depending on the risk appetite of regulators, in order to understand and to better identify the right risk to, proliferation of e-money issuers in the market, and understanding what the right balance is, and then being able to adjust with either guidance or circulars after. Another very important regulatory aspect is the use of agents, both banks and non-banks, to be permitted to use third-party agents, such as retail shops, etc. And the way that these agents are approved is also very important. We've seen a lot of fallbacks and a lot of constraints around the world when agent approval, the legal framework for agent registration or approvals can be cumbersome. For instance, if a regulator is trying to approve the registration of an agent by agent, or even in small bulk agent approvals and licensing schemes. So it's important to make sure that there is a reality around the number of agents that might come about, and putting in place very well-defined supervision aspects for instance, the e-money operator or the bank to be able to supervise that sector accordingly. Another incredibly important legal enabler is the risk-based customer due diligence, or CDD, proportionate anti-money laundering framework, to allow for lower risk accounts and lower risk transactions to be opened with fewer documentation requirements. Generally around the world, we see this being one ID and a photo that can be verified. And then there's many other ways to verify that now through remote onboarding, et cetera. And lastly, or the last two or three that are very important from a legal regulatory perspective, is financial consumer protection, particularly the consumer protection rules that are tailored to the full range of DFS providers and products. So for instance, there might be jurisdictions that have already created a consumer protection framework in order to create a holistic financial consumer protection activities between complaint handling, alternative dispute resolution, and market conduct. However, many of those rules and many of those standards have to be reviewed with keeping in mind digital finance, particularly as it includes disclosure and transparency for the consumer. As a mobile money product is being delivered through your mobile, you're no longer at the point of a branch where you can ask questions to staff members or see things on paper, and you have to be able to really understand and digest that information clearly in order to, be able to feel like you're received all of the capacity needed to make an informed decision. And there's many other tools like key facts or comparison tools that can be leveraged as policy initiatives. Lastly, the two other good practices we see, if you go back, yes, and then I'll quickly move through the rest, is policies or bills that address fintechs. This is generally under the form of a comprehensive fintech bill or a payment system act or central bank acts. In the case of Mexico, it was the fintech law. But in essence, recognizing the current nature of the payments legislation and supervision mandates across the institutions of regulators, and being able to create a more holistic system that includes fintech, cryptocurrencies, payment service providers, etc. And lastly, and one of the other most important, is having opportunities for innovation facilitation as well as acceleration. And we generally see this in the form of sandboxes as well as innovation hubs. So I think I'll stop there. And Mark, if you can just flash through the rest of the slides. And because these slides will be circulated, I understand, to all of the participants, but in the rest of the slides that you're able to just flash through quite quickly, we show some other pieces and some core pieces around what are some of those blueprint activities that you might have to consider in your jurisdiction in order to create an inclusive digital financial ecosystem. Yeah, Mark, I'm not sure if you're able to flash through till the end, but just so that you can get a sense of some of the other pieces of the puzzle. We at the UNCDF are very happy to have had the opportunity to present. And thank you to the honorable ministers in the room. And we do hope, and we want to extend a bit of extend that we are here and our regional office is open for the Caribbean, and we would very much invite anyone who would like to see any type of technical assistance, policy assistance, or even more initiatives to finance digital innovations that have promised for financial inclusion, to reach out to us. We will place our emails and our contact details with Vashti. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Helen and Mark. I am very sorry you have presented such a wealth of information. And I know that there will be questions from the audience. We could just start off with one from our remote participants. A question was asked, and I think this is directed to Mark, where one of the participants wanted to know why PWDs aren't highlighted as a group targeted for measurement by the IDIS system.
Thank you for the question. The groups, the marginalized groups that have been the focus of the digital economy scorecard have really been identified through discussion with our partners. And, we've taken a phased approach to really build out the analytics for marginalized groups over time. The start has been with women. This year, we're going deeper with youth. It's very much demand driven around where our partners are really having the greatest struggle at this moment in time. But I am sure that people with disabilities are on the radar, and I will also reference this with the team as well. So, but if you do have any demand for going deeper on this, I'd love to hear from you and discuss how we could take that further.
Dewey, I see a question from the audience from Cleveland. I believe you have a wireless mic. Yes, please. Go ahead. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you so much. Cleveland Thomas from the International Telecommunications Union. First, thanks very much for really excellent presentations that you give. I am wondering that recognizing that most countries, especially developing countries, small island states, do have some challenges. Challenges as it relates to technical resources, financial capabilities, and perhaps recognizing that, yes, there is this gap between the have and the have-nots. And that there is a view that if you do try to engage in some of the policies and regulations that are critical, which you articulated a few minutes ago, that the countries may not have the capacity really to execute some of these things. And you listed quite a lot. So the question then becomes, what are some of the creative options that might be available to countries? There is a view that perhaps the introductions of policies and regulations may stifle innovation in countries and in the region. And perhaps, Mark, when you look at the Uganda example you give, I take note that you had one policy change after your introduction. I don't know how many policies that you had proposed, and I don't know how long it may have taken even to have that one policy change introduced. So in summary, do you support the view by some that maybe there's no need for policies and regulations given the challenges that some countries are facing at this time? Over to you.
I will just quickly respond, but Helen, please jump in after. I know you've got a vantage point on this as well. Thank you for the question. I think it's a great point, especially, when we think about the example of Uganda, in that situation, what one of the key findings was that the level, all the various regulations and policies were not translating into outcomes in the key areas that they wanted to see results. And so, it was really understood that by reviewing what had emerged, dynamically over time and really looking at how to streamline in order to make the implementation of those policies more effective was in fact the greater priority, as opposed to, just looking at another policy. But, one of I think to your point about how, especially, countries that are smaller, that may have a lower population density, there's just a unique set of challenges. And one of the things that we are finding is that by measuring the digital economy in one country with a standardized framework, and then being able to see how another country is also measuring their digital economy helps our partners to identify across each other who their peers are and who is working from a similar stage of development to really find solutions that are more relevant for them. And this is why we've introduced the community of practice, because a lot of the best practice, a lot of the evidence, the research, it's from huge markets, huge countries, advanced countries where the technology mix, the way in which digitalization can be incentivized with the private sector is just radically different. And so we're really looking at ways to find learning opportunities among more relevant peers. But with that, I will just ask Helen if you want to talk on this as well.
Sure. Thank you very much, Cleveland. I think you bring up an excellent point, many in fact. I think there's a few realities that we also have to consider. One, let's say that there is even a expediting of a particular order or e-money issuance, but then there's not enough capacity to supervise. Do you still license without the capacity and training in place to do the adequate supervision? And there's a lot of different ways to answer that. On the one hand, there's opportunities to look at some of the global examples of how they've done the supervision of those types of activities, particularly non-bank e-money, activities. And I focus on that just because not only is it a big enabler, but it's something that us at the international community and so many countries have so much experience in, that it's something that we believe is kind of more well-known, well-tested and better understood. And so for these areas of fintech and digital finance that are maybe a little bit better understood, a little bit more well-known, particularly around mobile money and non-bank e-money issuance, I think there's opportunity to license or be able to put in place flexibility to even provisionally license or provide a no objection for some of these players to operate, and then taking a careful and considered 6-month or 1 year or 2 year, however you want to do it, provisional licensing scheme if you want to closely monitor these actors over time prior to issuing some larger guidance. At the same time, there are those sandbox activities. Sandbox is a very good way to essentially tackle what you're mentioning, but at the same time, it's incredibly resource heavy. Sandbox, I know everybody has probably heard the term, a regulatory sandbox, but the thing is that no two sandboxes look alike. And when people are talking about sandboxes, what are they talking about? A sandbox with a capital S in Singapore and in the UK and others have almost 40 to 50 people behind them. And that's why when you see these initiatives coming out around the acceleration and the innovation acceleration, and then they have 20 different calls for regulatory sandbox for different innovations to understand how to test and adopt their regulatory framework accordingly, it is very resourced behind it. And so certainly there shouldn't be, when you are working with regulators and a team of 5 people, for instance, all with shared duties or shared responsibilities, and this is just another one within your job description, you have to take a wildly different approach. And I think the wildly different approaches are moving a little bit more flexibly with the opportunity for some exemptions, no objections, perhaps provisional licensing or sandbox express type tools, which I much more narrowly defined so that it's not overwhelming to the supervisors or the regulators who will be the ones who have to, keep the stability in the market. Right. And I think someone was just even chatting, there's not a one size fits all. So those are some of the enablers, but it doesn't mean that you need to come at each of these enablers with all of the bells and whistles behind each of those initiatives that we've seen in some countries. There's always a tailored approach that can be taken, and also lighter touch policy tools that can be employed to achieve some of the same goals.
Very much, Helen and Mark, for the amazing presentation and also the wonderful responses. We'd like to thank you for your participation, and hopefully on the next occasion, we will be able to meet you both in person.